Hi, I'm Steve Packard. Welcome to Cyber Risk Analysis. And today we're going to be looking at managing third-party risks in cybersecurity. Third-party risks are something that we hear a lot about. There's something that a lot of people worry about, and there's something that a lot of people have a lot of trouble understanding how they can be controlled. In fact, I've heard from some that this is an insurmountable challenge, that because there are so many third-party risks in cybersecurity, that there's nothing we can do, that it's just going to be high loss, and that there's nothing we can do to predict these losses or avoid them. Well, happily, that's not actually true. In fact, third-party risk management is a very mature area, and it can be managed very effectively. So without further ado, let's start the presentation on third-party risk management in cybersecurity, what it is, and how it is done. But I guess the first question is, what is third-party risk? Well, that's a good question. It's the risk of loss or failure at another organization basically coming back and being a loss at your organization or with you. So that could be a vendor, it could be a service provider, it could even be a client you depend on very heavily for your revenue. But organizations do have limited control over third parties, and these can include anybody. They can include outages from an ISP, from a cloud service provider. It could be your credit card processor, it could be your bank. Any service provider who you rely on, if there's an extended outage, either because they're out or because possibly the infrastructure's out, possibly there's a line down on your internet lines. This can absolutely be a problem. There's also data leaks and data breaches. This could happen when you share your data with a third party, such as a data clearinghouse or billing processor, perhaps your payroll processor. There could also be intrusion into your system. And this is especially true with MSPs, managed service providers, and managed service security providers. They're a very potent third-party risk, and the reason for that is that they typically have access into your system. So they might have privileged access. They're handling your security. But if they get breached or there's a bad guy on their premises or something, you could have a big problem there. And these third-party risks can be difficult because they can be systemic, meaning that they may hit many companies at once. It may be an outage of a major service provider in a whole region, right? And that could be a huge loss for the economy. That could mean that you can't rely on mutual aid of peers because they've also lost their service provider. So it can be very systemic. And it's not unusual at all to have a multi-organization kill chain. And what I mean by that is that you could have one organization knocked over, let's say a software provider, and then that's used as a third-party attack against an MSP, and then that's used as a third-party attack against a financial firm, and then that data is leveraged. So they could use this as a domino effect, the bad guys can. And two types of third-party risks are zero-day hacks and supply chain hacks. And these are typically seen in software, although they could be seen in hardware too. So basically what you have is you have these software attacks, you have MSPs and privileged access, you have service providers, and you have third parties who you share your data with. So this may sound pretty rough, but don't worry, there are definitely ways that this can be managed. So you may be aware that there have been more than a few third-party attacks out there, and that these have happened quite a few times, right? There's been SolarWinds, there's been MoveOn. Why is that? Is this inherent to IT products? It's not so much that. What it really is it's a lack of a mature, trusted ecosystem of vendors and products. There's a lack of recognition and enforcement of certifications. So there are certifications, there are industry standards out there, but they're very rarely are they paid attention to the extent that they should be. Companies do tend to be incentivized to release software as soon as possible. This is very important. The software business, the IT business is extremely competitive, and being the first to market with something is very important. These products, these software products frequently are falling behind schedule. There's a real rush to get them out the door. The market rarely really demands that they be tested and audited. There are certainly secure software development cycles. There are ways that software can be tested. There are independent testing and auditing agencies. But you don't see a whole lot of that because very few of the clients of a software company actually demand that. And it's not generally required. And they do tend to be released without a warranty. And the risk is basically put onto the purchaser. You'll look at the EULA, the End User License Agreement, and you'll often see that this product is provided without warranty, without guarantee, and all risk is assumed by the buyer. It will say something like that, which is really, that's really something that we shouldn't have in software products that are used where the stakes are as high as they are. These are products that are frequently being used in life-critical situations where there's billions of dollars on the line. most IT companies still hold on to the fact that they were born in a garage and they're a move fast and break things company. They really do not want to be the first to offer their software with any sort of warranty or guarantee. It's quite ridiculous, but there aren't a whole lot of government regulations either. The government hasn't done anything about this. Mandatory requirements are something that the industry has fought against so hard, and not only the software industry, but even like the financial industry, the healthcare industry. They just do not want any type of mandatory requirements. And so what you have is really just a very immature system, and there's a lack of ownership. Nobody wants to take responsibility, and the other thing is that because certifications are not taken seriously, just about anybody can call themselves a managed service provider, a managed service security provider. I would say if they're not certified, if they don't have the CISP, if they don't have somebody with the Certified Information System Security Professional or an equivalent running the place, they are not a managed service security provider. They're just a managed service provider. And managed service providers are not generally security focused. They may have jumped on that bandwagon for that gold rush, but they're generally not. And they're not professionals if they're not certified. So next, let's consider what some of these types of attacks are. And I'm first going to talk about zero-day, because that's something you may have heard of and may not be familiar with. What is a zero-day hack? Well, a zero-day hack is when there's a product that has a backdoor or a hack or a weakness discovered in it. For example, it's discovered that there's a program that you're supposed to log into with a password, but it turns out that if you fill the password field up with enough junk and you hit the right buttons fast enough, you could get in without it. That would be considered a software bug. And if that's discovered first by the manufacturer, they issue a patch and everything, well, that's one thing. Then you have a certain number of days, you would say, to respond to that. But 0 day means that we don't know about it. Our first indication that the software has a bug in it is that the bad guys discovered it, and we start seeing companies go down. So that's why it's called a 0 day, because there's 0 days to respond to it. They found it first. Typically, though, on day 0, there's only going to be a small number of victims. They're not generally going to be able to find it and exploit it that widely, so you'd have to be pretty unlucky to actually be hit on day 0. Most attacks do happen over the ensuing months, and typically a 0 day, when it is detected, it will be reported, and there will generally be a workaround that will be issued right away, which will be something like do not use this software without close monitoring, turn off external connections. In the worst cases, they may say discontinue using this product immediately, but that's pretty rare. More often, it's going to be some sort of a workaround or mitigated control, and then a patch or an update will be issued very quickly. And these updates need to be put out there quickly because they are very critical if it is a 0 day, a true 0 day, and it's being taken advantage of in the wild. It's not uncommon at all for companies to just not notice this, right? Like the software is recalled, there's a patch issued, it's in the news, but nobody at the Acme Tool and Die Company was watching the news that night, and nobody from the Acme Tool and Die Company is actually looking at cyber security bulletins, and nobody from the Acme Tool and Die Company is in charge of making sure that there are no 0 days. And then several months later, the Acme Tool and Die Company is hit by it. That's a very common problem. You see that all the time. I've actually seen 0 days in the wild that were years old. I've seen 0 day attacks. In fact, there's one that dates all the way back to 2012, and believe it or not, you still see that vulnerability out there. And although it's difficult to prevent them, it's not impossible. It's something that software companies have tried to avoid being held liable for. But usually, it can be mitigated. The way it can be mitigated is just by carefully controlling access to your software, by putting it behind a firewall. That way, even if it is compromised, if it's behind a firewall, that is usually going to be enough to stop it. The primary reason that these happen is because there's a lack of monitoring. So as I said, you may have a small company or even a medium company or surprisingly even a large company, and you will find that they will go for extended periods of time completely oblivious to the fact that their software is making them a sitting duck because they just don't know. So next, what is a software supply chain attack? So that's similar to a 0 day because like a 0 day, it is third party. It's outside the control of an organization, right? You can't control how everybody writes their software. You can't control how everybody runs their services. But so that much makes it similar. But the difference is that it is not a bug. It is not something that is found there accidentally. That, oops, it turns out there's a way around the security feature. No, it's intentionally inserted. And so that can make it very dangerous. SolarWinds would be an example of that, where the company was breached by an outside attacker. And what they did was they put malicious code right into the software. That's it's really a nightmare because this could get through your antivirus software. They could do almost anything if they get in there. There are some limits though. One of the things is that they do try to avoid being detected. So normally it won't do anything that dramatic, at least not right away. So this does happen from the breach of a vendor or possibly an insider. There are also concerns about foreign countries. China, for example. There are a lot of products that come from China, a lot of hardware products, a lot of software products now. And there's just concern that the Chinese government could be in bed with these companies. And if that's the case, then they have developer access to the lowest level code. That is very tough. It could also happen when a vendor reuses a code from another vendor. Oh, this is very important. It's entirely possible, this is true with 0 days as well, that it's not so much that the vendor has a bug in their code or that the vendor was attacked. They may have a vendor. So for example, you may have a software company that licenses standard software libraries or standard building blocks for their software. They may not build the whole interface for their software, right? They just license that. And if that has a 0 day in it, then or a software supply chain attack, then that could carry over. Open source is something that is sometimes touted as being a mitigator to this. Open source is free software where it's developed by community and the code is available for review. This is not immune, though. It has its advantages, but the disadvantage is that open source software can be so very complicated that it's possible that a malicious actor could bury code in it that's very difficult to understand. But they can be very sophisticated. They can attack, as I said, they can be very difficult to detect because by definition they're able to get through your software. I mean, worst case scenario, it is your firewall software, right? Worst case scenario, it is the security software. So it can be very systemic. And as I mentioned, foreign governments are a major concern. That's probably one of the biggest concerns with supply chain attacks. They're really very sophisticated in that. And the other thing is that a foreign intelligence agency is more likely to get away with it because if a ransomware gang were to use a software supply chain attack, what would happen is they would blow their cover right away, right? As soon as they start to demand the ransom, you know that something's up. And that's what they try to do. Whereas a foreign intelligence service is far more likely to be looking to lay low and exfiltrate minimal data. They're just looking for strategically important data. They're not looking to make a ruckus or anything. So there are other types of third-party risks. As I mentioned, service outages from major vendors, cloud service providers. And you have to be careful with this because you may not even really think of it, but there are a lot of service providers who you rely on. It's your bank, credit card company. There could also be an intrusion onto your system, and that's often because there are vendors. As I said, MSPs, MSSPs, they're especially high risk, but any contractor, any vendor, anybody who you allow onto your systems in any privileged manner could potentially be breached, and that could be considered a third-party risk. And so data leaks are also a third-party risk. And that's because you often have to share your private data with other organizations. For example, if you're a medical institution, you probably are using an external billing partner. You're using some contractor who processes your billing, sends it out to the insurance companies or to Medicaid, and that would be a third-party risk right there. One of the problems with something like that is that while you may be able to indemnify them to some degree, there are often laws that will mean that you're still held responsible. So an example of that would be the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA. That's a law that applies to banking and financing. And it explicitly states that when you have financial data, that is your responsibility if you're the primary custodian of that. And if you're utilizing a contractor or a third party to manage your data, it does not absolve you of responsibility at all. You are still where the buck stops there. There are a lot of laws like that. So there's also the fact that third parties may manage some of your security services. As I said, that is really kind of creepy. You really have a fox in the hen house when that happens. And they may have privileged info that can be used for you in an attack. That's another thing, is that you may not even think of it, but your third-party provider may have any kind of PII or information on your inside systems. They may have done business with you in a way that has exposed them to sensitive data that they could use against you, or maybe not them, maybe they get hacked. Also, in a sense, your clients and customers could be a third-party risk because if you really rely on a few customers, there are certain organizations that may have really bet the farm on a particular contract with a particular client, and that client goes down and they're not able to do business, that could be just as bad as well. And as I mentioned, you may not even be aware of all the third parties you rely on because really there are a lot of them. However, that's okay because there are ways of dealing with this. To begin with, you want to have good proactive relationship management. You want to be, I guess the way I put it is very non-promiscuous with who you're looking to do business with in any sort of privileged sense. If there's somebody who you're going to let into your security areas, if you're going to be using their services to manage anything that is of great importance, you want to make sure that you know who they are. You want to make sure that you have a very full understanding of all your security responsibilities. What is your responsibility? What are you supposed to do to keep your data safe? What are they supposed to do? Who is responsible if something goes wrong? And you want to read all the contracts carefully. You want to keep indemnification in mind, and you want to make sure that you have an understanding of what the regulatory requirements and legal liabilities are. Because as I said, there are many cases where you can indemnify a contractor or a provider with risk, but there are others where you can't for regulatory reasons. And you want to assure that your vendors have proper insurance and bond for potential risks, because whether or not they're indemnified, if it's a multi-billion-dollar loss on their end and they don't have it, then you could sue them, but there ain't no money there. So make sure that you understand that. Make sure that you have the right bonding, the right insurance. But it's like anything else like this, right? You would do the same with a mover or any other service that you were using in reality or in cyberspace. So you do want to ask them the tough questions. You really do. And you also want to utilize service level agreements. Those are SLAs. Make sure you understand the SLAs, what obligations come with them, and whether or not there are really any teeth on those for enforcement. And you can utilize SOC reporting, which is Service Organization Control Reports. Service Organization Control Reporting is a type of auditing which is done by service organizations. And the point of Service Organization Control Reports is to verify that the service organization has the right controls in place. And there's actually a whole hierarchy of this. There's SOC 1, SOC 1 Type 2, SOC 2. I'm not going to go into that, but SOC reporting is a very important way of making sure that those SLAs are being met and that you do have the organization controls that you agreed to in place. You want to require industry certifications, accreditations. Again, MSSPs, managed service security providers, anybody who's a security provider, make sure that they're setting CISP, Certified Information Systems Security Professional, certified professionals. If the manager of the product is not CISP certified, if there's a partner selling on the product, they're not CISP certified, that's not good. It's really not. And if there's nobody in the practice who is CISP certified, the head of the practice isn't. If you ever come across a security practice that is not certified, that is not a legitimate security practice, and you really shouldn't take their advice on anything. You should utilize trusted industry group and peer reviews. That is an immature system, but it is coming into place a little bit. There are some groups now that are working on sort of a peer review, a sort of referral system for IT and cybersecurity services. But I mean, no matter what, demand transparency. Ask the hard questions, right? Make sure that they have their house in order. This is very important. You also want to avoid vendor overdependence. There's no such thing as a 100% reliable vendor, right? There never is. We never know what's going to happen. There could be something crazy. They could be bought out or merged or change their policies or something. So you want to use vendor neutral solutions whenever possible. You don't want to get into what's called vendor lock-in, which is where they would set you up with a product that's not compatible with anybody else's. You can't export your data to somebody else's. You want to avoid that. And so that's where open source solutions, industry standards, they have huge advantages here because they're portable. You can take them from one solution provider to another. You can also consider alternative sources or multi-vendor solutions, and that's especially important with cloud. If you're really reliant on AWS, Amazon Web Services Cloud, you might also want to consider whether or not you have a cold backup account available in Google or in Microsoft's Azure cloud. That'd be what you call a multi-cloud solution. You also want to evaluate what the potential losses are for downtime. So this is very important to your business continuity planning. You want to understand how much downtime can you have from a given system before you incur losses, and that's going to be different for every company. Sometimes it's needed constantly. Sometimes there's a period that you could tolerate losing a service, and you could just kind of cache things and put them aside. Another important thing is that you want to assure that there's local failover for critical cloud services. I cannot tell you how important this is. If you have a generator, if you're a medical institution, if you're emergency services, if you just can't afford to lose your ability to do work ever because it's life critical or it's just you're going to lose too much, so you have to have a backup generator, then you have to have a backup failover for a cloud service outage, because just as a generator might be needed because somebody crashes into a phone pole or lightning strikes a substation or something. That can happen with your internet connection too, right? Lightning could strike something. Lines go down. If you really cannot afford to ever lose it, then you have to have a local backup available, even if you are mostly reliable on the cloud. You want to keep a backup copy of critical data with a separate entity. That is so important. Again, if you're using AWS, Amazon Web Services, I'm really weary about keeping a backup copy on the same account of AWS. There are ways that they say you can sequester it and you can have like a different account, but I would really prefer to have your backup separate from your main account so that if that's taken over, you have a separate backup copy. And of course, you want to test that, just like your local failover. Test, practice, figure out what your contingency operations are, and include these in your business continuity planning. So again, you want to think to yourself, okay, we're a retail operation. What happens if our internet connection goes down and we can't take credit cards? Does that mean we have to close? Is there another option? Could we maybe use like a squared application on a phone? Would that meet our regulatory requirements? And also evaluate your obligation to other organizations and keep tabs on any outages and service changes. And remember, these are the same things that are very important in a natural disaster or any sort of unplanned emergency. This is all part of business continuity planning, is not allowing your chain to have a weak link in it. You want to really limit your trust relationships. So you want to keep track of what your third parties have access to. You want to really keep track of that. You want to hold your contractors, any third parties who have access to your systems, hold them to at least the same standards of your employees. If your employees need to have MFA per DOD, your contractors do too, and it has to be at least as good as yours. If you have to background check your employees, make sure your contractors do too. They have to follow at least the same standards as you. You should limit access to your systems on need to know. That's called PLP, Principle of Least Privilege. And you want to avoid providing private data to third parties if possible. Well, how is that possible? What if they're a payroll provider? Well, in that case, you could use like something called masking or tokenization. So that's the next part. Is what you could do there is don't give them your employee's social security number. Give them an employee reference number. If you're dealing with a medical billing provider, you might ask yourself, do I really need to provide them with all the medical records? Could I just provide them with a brief description and a billing code? You might be able to get away with that. But really, do not provide excess data if you can avoid it. And if you can avoid it, replace personal identifying information with tokens like reference numbers that are strictly internal. That's a really powerful control. You can require accounting of your private data and its use and deletion. So this might be difficult for smaller organizations and when you have a lot of vendor relationships. But if you have a very important vendor relationship, let's say you're a bank and you have a vendor who processes a lot of your billing data, you should require that they provide you an audit report for what they do on their end. They should be very transparent. Again, this does go back to transparency, but make sure that you understand how they're handling it. Read all your contracts. And there are times when you could use DRM technologies. There are times you could use blockchains. This isn't universal, but there are technologies out there that allow you to control the data even though a third party has access to it. So they might not be able to download it, but they can view it in your cloud. And maybe that's good enough in certain circumstances. There are certain programs that you could send that will enforce certain amounts of limited access even on their end. But there are limits to that. But in an ideal world, we would leverage the most zero trust methods. And so a blockchain can be used in a very zero trust way, where transactions are processed in an anonymous way, where data is exchanged anonymously. If you could do that, those technical controls are excellent, like DRM, like blockchain. But regardless, you want to document all your transactions. You want to hold those who have access to your system to the highest standards. Hold your systems to the highest standards. Log everything, document everything, retain those logs, immutable backups. Make sure you have that logging. And make sure any contractors or any third parties who have access to your data understand that they will be watched and everything will be documented. You also want to use segmented networks and systems to isolate any problems. So segment these things, build walls between them, silo your important systems. So here are some additional important controls. Firewalls are critical. They are absolutely critical to first and third party risk. You want to require all entities to use the highest standards for access control. I know I'm being repetitive on that, but that is so important. You want to monitor all your systems. And IPS and IDS, that's intrusion prevention, intrusion detection systems. There's some very advanced ones out there. There's some AI-based ones. And these monitor for any anomalous activity. You could use the You should use pen testing. That's a penetration testing. And you should utilize that on your software ideally. So even if it's third-party software, a third-party system, you could still do your own full internal penetration test. That can be expensive, but in certain circumstances, it is worthwhile. And you should always fully monitor the most secure environments. DLP is a powerful control for data leakage. DLP is data leak prevention, and that is monitoring your egresses and your endpoints. And what that will do is if there's something unusual, like all of a sudden it sees hundreds of social security numbers being emailed out, or it sees private patient records are being downloaded by an external entity, it will flag that. It may block that. Problem with that is that then you have to go investigate, because sometimes it will be a false alarm. So that's a lot for some organizations, but for larger organizations, it's not terrible. You can get DLP as a service too. You want to maintain an up-to-date IT asset inventory because you can't protect what you don't know you have. And you want to automate patch management and version control. That's very important too. Remember I was talking about 0 days and patches. You want to get that done as quickly as possible. Thankfully, it can be automated. You want to build your network in segments. So to go into this in a little bit more detail, what you're actually trying to do here is you're trying to run your organization more like it is multiple organizations. And you want to implement financial controls on your bank and credit accounts. This is very important because a lot of times third-party risks and third-party intrusions are basically after one thing, and that is to commit financial fraud. Thankfully, there are some very good controls for this that you can put into place with your banking, with your credit cards, with your payment processors, which include such things as secure escrow. So if you implement those, you'll be able to avoid a lot of financial fraud risks. I'm also going to talk a little bit about managing cloud risks, even though I did already. But cloud is cloud is unique in some ways. It is very third-party. There's really no zero trust in cloud. You are trusting AWS, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. You have to. And so in those circumstances, you want to really understand what their shared responsibility model is. That's how cloud service providers typically work. They're responsible for certain things. You are too. You're responsible for updating a lot of the software. They're responsible for updating a lot of the hardware. So you want to understand that. You want to use the compliance and monitoring tools available in the cloud so that nothing you have is particularly vulnerable to a third party getting in on it. That can be very important. And you want to make sure that you're aware of all your third-party cloud relationships, because you may think that your only relationship is basically AWS, right? You have the Amazon cloud, but AWS has its own marketplace where there are services and features provided by third parties. You may have AWS with a particular enhancement from a particular third party, so it's important to understand that. And you want to understand the built-in backups and redundancy features in cloud. So again, going back to AWS, they have different data centers, different availability zones. And if you pay a little bit more, you could have your data in multiple places at the same time for additional failover resistance. If you want to save money, you can reduce that, but that does increase risk. You could also use different sorts of availability zones. So you really do want to understand that those features of the cloud, and also the containerization. How is your private code containerized? What is keeping it away from others? How is the security segmented, and how are the walls put up? You want to understand how the hosting and architecture works overall. You also may want to use multiple cloud solutions, multi-cloud solutions, if it's really mission critical. So that goes back to what I was saying. If it's that important, you don't want to rely on just one provider who, if they go offline, you'll be dead. And again, maintain your offline backups and other cloud providers. Do not keep all your backup copies. Do not keep all your backup capacity with one provider. Because even though these providers do a pretty good job of making sure that they don't all go down at once, they say it's like 1,000,000 to 1 odds that one of their data centers will go down at AWS, but who really knows, right? We don't have real world data to prove that. There have been issues. So you also want to use the highest levels of access control for your cloud environment, so that way you're doing everything you would for on-prem with hardware-based access control, verification, logging. That all applies to cloud environments too. And now here's an example of a bona fide supply chain attack, and really one of the worst I've ever seen, and that is SolarWinds. SolarWinds is an example of really the most difficult type of supply chain attack, because this was not a ransomware attack. They were not looking to just break things down, bust things up, and get some money for it. This was a foreign intelligence agency. It was the Russian intelligence agency. And this is one that I'm very familiar with. It was quite a nightmare, because this is the type of attack where the organization can lay low for months, just quietly snooping and just sending back minimal data so they're not detected. This was a very difficult one to detect, but it was eventually detected. Thankfully, these type of attacks are not things that every organization has to worry about. I was at a Big Four at the time, so of course they would be attacked because a foreign intelligence agency figures there's a big government contractor. There might be some juicy data there, but the Acme Tool and Die Company is not likely to be attacked in this manner. Even if they did download compromised software, it is more than likely that they would not be the victim of any sort of discrete long-term attack. Although it is possible that this could also be exploited for ransomware, but in that case, it would normally be caught pretty fast. But the primary goal of this attack, as I said, it's to lay low and remain undetected. So it's something like a sleeper cell, and that does kind of limit how much problems it could cause you. Although if you're not monitoring your egresses at all, they can still exfiltrate a lot of data, and many places don't. The root cause of the SolarWinds does appear to have been shoddy security at the vendor, SolarWinds themselves. They had said in audit reports and attestations that they had a lot of security controls that they didn't. It turns out that some of their passwords were just exceptionally weak. They did not have MFA. It was absolutely terrible, their security. So that's how that happened. And we did learn quite a few lessons. For example, the whole trust but verify. Boy, would have been nice to have an external auditor or somebody who was actually checking up on that at SolarWinds. We also learned how to detect these because they did leave anomalies, but they weren't easily detected by most organizations. Thankfully, though, FireEye, which is an excellent security provider, was able to detect them. They weren't doing anything that was that noticeable, but they were doing some anomalous things. They were getting into some secure areas and forging some security credentials, and it was detected. But the organizations that are able to deal with this the best are the ones that keep secure log files. So they have logs that you can rely on. They're kept on secure media separately, and they're able to look back forensically and figure out what was compromised and what wasn't. Right now, I will tell you the organization that I was at the time, did a very thorough investigation of what could have possibly been exfiltrated. What they came to the conclusion of was that there were other mitigating controls, for example, encryption and segmentation, which would have kept that SolarWinds software away from most of their sensitive client files. So at the end of the day, because they had secure logging and because they were very careful about things, they were able to avoid any losses here. But these are very dangerous attacks, and they're not insurmountable, but they are difficult. So let's talk about some other real-world examples and how they can be mitigated and what can be done and what can be done to avoid these. Google recently accidentally deleted the records of a major pension fund and their backups. Remember how I said don't keep your backups and your main stuff on the same provider, segment them, put them in different places with different permission? That's exactly why. This was not a malicious attack or anything. It was an honest-to-God mistake, but thankfully that organization did have backups that were not on Google and they were able to restore it, but it was a huge pension fund. McDonald's recently had a global outage due to a credit card processor. And when you think about it, a company like McDonald's, which has that big of a global presence and is that important, could lose that much money in a single day if they have to close their stores, which many of them did. They probably should have multiple credit card processors. They probably should have policies and procedures that would allow them to fail over to something else. They didn't. So they lost a day, in some places 2 days of work. And for a company that big, that is a lot of money. It would have been a lot cheaper to have an alternate billing provider. Major healthcare chains. So this is one that I know about. They were breached by a third-party billing company. This particular healthcare organization has excellent security in-house. But again, they're third parties. It's limited what they could do there. However, this probably could have been avoided if they had used a lot of data masking, a lot of data tokenization. If they had tried very hard to send that biller the minimal amount of information that they needed to actually process those bills, if they had audited them, 20/20 hindsight, it could have been avoided. And there are also cases of hospitals that have been unable to conduct business or access medical records because of internet outages or cloud service outages. At Yale, New Haven, which is near me, there was an attack against the cloud provider that provided the information that was necessary to run their cancer treatment robots, the robots that do radiation therapy. Yeah, they were knocked offline, but you have to ask yourself, if it's that critical, should you really be dependent on the cloud? Well, you really shouldn't. There have been a number of other banking and credit card processing outages, and those happen for various reasons, some of them malicious, some not. There have also been outages of phone systems and telecommunications. AT&T had a terrible outage not that long ago. So these can happen too. There are all sorts of medical and financial problems that have been faced due to UHC, United Healthcare. That left many organizations unable to pay their bills, unable to process their bills, unable to fill prescriptions. That's pretty bad too, but it does leave you asking, if it's a prescription, if it's insulin or something that somebody really needs, shouldn't there be a way to fill it that does not require a cloud service provider? And yeah, there have been a lot of those because the medical sector has been attacked so heavily. So it's not just UHC, that's the worst one, but there have been others. There have also been times when there have been natural disasters that have limited bandwidth. They've knocked organizations offline. So this is something you should always keep in mind for any sort of business continuity. There are occasions when vendors have gone out of business. So it's not always a technical failure. It could also be an administrative failure. Maybe you really expected a service to be there, but the company went under, they went bankrupt, their CEO was killed in a plane crash, and they took another direction. Who knows? You know, stuff happens, and you have to be ready for that whenever you're dealing with any third party. Then you also have to remember that business email compromise is frequent. So when you get a business email from a trusted party, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a trusted email. It could be that the billing people over at your contractor have had their email account hacked, right? And so that comes back to that financial fraud controls. That will usually do pretty well, because when they do hack the email of a business and they start sending out business emails, more likely than not, they're trying to commit some sort of fund transfer fraud, or they're just trying to trick you into getting into your system. But these are all risks that can be mitigated very, very effectively. Another thing is Microsoft Information Protection, which is a critical service that is used to make sure that documents are properly retained. I had a client I was working at, and we were using Microsoft Information Protection to make sure that all of their regulatory documents, which had to go out to a utilities commission, were retained and put into the regulatory documents folder for submission to the Public Utility Commission. And this was using Microsoft Information Protection, which is a cloud service, except Microsoft somehow bungled an upgrade of it or something, and that caused it to go down, and that was a problem. So that goes back to monitoring and making sure that you're aware of these things, because they did, of course, send a notice out that said, hey, we goofed and our information protection is down this week, but if you weren't reading your email or you didn't get tuned into that, you might not know, and that's not good at all. So there are a lot of real-world examples out there of different types of third-party risks, of contractors, of those who have access to your systems, of those who have access to your data because you gave it to them. They can be hit. There could also be service outages that are not caused by malicious activity. There could also be all sorts of administrative problems. There could also be, various information can be leaked that will allow somebody into your system because they got it from a third party. These are all third-party risks. The important thing to know, they're not insurmountable. They're never insurmountable. No risk in cybersecurity is ever insurmountable. There's no reason to be frightened of this. Third-party risk is absolutely something that can be managed and can be conquered.